Yes, folks, it's part 2 of the Genesis versus the Nintendo Entertainment System. Last video was cut short, and I didn't feel like editing it or anything. I just want to get to the point. So here we have part 2 now. Mostly talking about 1991 and some other things. So let's put this away and get back to the list. So last time I was at the Immortal. And did I stop talking about that? I think I spoke enough about it. Let's see, where are the pictures? Here we go. So Immortal was released, an RPG game for the Genesis, also released for the Nintendo, very hard. Also for the Genesis was Might and Magic Part 2, another RPG for the Genesis. So they were starting to be released. And some of them are okay, like this one. But, I mean, this game was from, like, what, 1985 on the PC or something? So for many it was outdated. And I didn't know this game was released for the Genesis until I started doing my homework. Let's talk about NHL hockey. Now that was a big game. So this was the first good hockey game for the Genesis, and the sequels NHL PA 93 and NHL 94 would be huge successes. I cannot exaggerate that. This game wasn't that good yet. Not that many people had a Genesis yet, so not that many people played it. And interestingly, at the time, I don't think it was that much better than Blades of Steel for the Nintendo. Now, what's interesting is that the Genesis was already trying to profile itself as a sports console. But in all fairness, well, like I said, Blades of Steel was just as good as this game. The baseball games, we had Baseball Stars for the Nintendo, which was better than Tommy the Sorta. I talked about that last video. When it came to basketball, I think Double Dribble, also by Konami, was better than Pat Riley's basketball. And finally, football, we had Tecmo Bowl on the NES, which was better than Madden for most people. So the Genesis wasn't quite up there when it came to being a better sports console yet, but that would change in a year or two, with especially with FIFA 93. And NHL PL 93. Actually, FIFA was released late 93, which would be the 94 season. Anyhow, so, yeah. But this was a breakthrough hit for the Electronic Arts and solidified them as being an excellent sports creator. And late 1991, we also finally had the release of Outrun for the Genesis, which didn't look as awesome. The sound wasn't as good either, and you couldn't sit in the car, but still... we all saw it coming eventually, and we're glad it finally was there. But what can I say? This game was 5 years old by now, so we weren't that excited. Now, Shine in the Darkness is yet another RPG for the Genesis. I've never played it, but people say it's pretty good. And 1991 featured a huge hit for Electronic Arts, namely Road Rash, which you ride bicycles and can knock each other, sometimes with weapons. I never liked it that much. You could play two players simultaneously, which is usually what I would do. Even single player, though, had very bad frame rates, and it's just a very simple racing game. I guess the most fun is buying upgrades for your bike, but still, people loved it, and that meant a lot to the Genesis. Let's see, I think the list continues here. Oh yeah, now we're at Streets of Rage. Now this was an important one. The Super Nintendo had Final Fight, but everybody agreed that Streets of Rage, despite having smaller sprites, was a better game because it was multiplayer, and it was really cool having all those moves. So you have to understand, Final Fight was probably, up until then, still the biggest game in the arcades, together with Turtles. And we were really looking for the Super Nintendo version coming out, and we couldn't choose Guy, and we couldn't play with the two players at the same time. With Streets of Rage, which some of our Genesis friends had, and we loved it. It's a very good fighting game. And, well, a year later came Streets of Rage 2, but this was, at the time, probably the best beat-em-up ever made. So that was great for Genesis owners. Speedball 2. Now, this is a very European thing. I always like to say that Americans were playing Tecmo Ball, but the British were playing Speedball 2. It's a futuristic sci-fi kind of football-like game where you could throw the ball against the wall and all these other things going on here. The season mode was very interesting because... I've never played, but I understand that you can evolve your team and all that. Mostly famous for its Amiga version, but the Genesis having the same processor chip, namely the Motorola 68K. From what I understand, this is just like the Amiga version. And I don't think Americans got into it, but still you should have, because the British, they love this game. Now, speaking of a game Americans love, Toe Jam and Earl, one of the coolest games ever made. It's an adventure game where you don't kill that many enemies. You're mostly running away, but there's so many funny things to come across. Just walking around, trying to get all the parts. You could do it together with a friend, and it was great collecting all the gold pieces together. Instant classic. And, okay. Now, never heard of this game before until recently. Warsong looks a lot like Fire Emblem, maybe Advance Wars. Apparently a very good strategy game for the Genesis. Who would have known? So, before the Shining Force series took over. Now, Wonder Boy. I get all these Wonder Boy games confused. I know the Master System game is great as one of the first Metroidvania games. So this is a Wonder Boy called Monster World. And I don't know, it looks like an adventure game, and it gets good grades, so probably check it out if you're into that genre. Rolling Thunder 2 was very popular in Europe. It's kind of like elevator action, I think. No, it's kind of like a shinobi game. That's what it is. So you can jump on the top half or bottom half of the screen, and you shoot people. Good action. It's kind of like playing James Bond. I think it was an arcade game too, but I've never seen it. Now here's a hidden gem. Buck Rogers, that's a long name. Oh yeah, Countdown to Doomsday. This is an RPG with quite some cinematics, a lot of text. So people love to play this game. I've never played it. I've never heard of it until like about 3 years ago. So you might want to look into that. Hidden gem on the Genesis. So this is all 1991 so far. Sorry, this is late 1991, near Christmas season. From England, we also have Chuck Rock, which was also on the Amiga. Kind of okay platforming game. I guess it got good grades because the people in Europe loved it. And I chose the games for this list depending on two things. First of all, have I heard a lot of people talk about a game being good? And or does it have a high score on Moby Games? This is one of those games that had a high score on Moby Games, so I added it to the list. Devil's Crush. This is interesting. I think it was also for the TurboGrafx 16. Yeah, definitely here. The previous version of this game was one of the release titles. I can't come up with the name. Anyhow, this is a cyber galactic fantasy pinball. Really cool. I always thought that Sonic Spinball was the first adventure pinball game, or maybe Kirby's pinball game. But no, this was actually one of the first two. Is Dragon's Fury, is that like the third version, or is it the other name of this game? Oh, well, as you can clearly tell, I never played this game and haven't done enough homework, but a lot of people talk about how awesome this game was on the Genesis, and you can get it at late 1991. Now, another British game, rather mediocre platformer game from what I could tell, also for the Amiga, being ported to the Genesis and getting high grades, probably mostly in British magazines, so that's why it's listed here. James Bond 2. Yeah, James Bond 2. What else can I say? Madden got a sequel in a year later, and this one was better because you could now play two players at the same time, which was really neat. And yeah, also released for the Super Nintendo, but the Genesis version was definitely better, and it had that infamous ambulance which would ride into the screen and knock over players. That was hilarious. So EA releasing more great games for the Genesis. And finally, another huge hit, Quackshot. Yeah, Indiana Jones with a plunger gun. Yeah, very popular. I think it was made by Sega, not by Capcom. And quality platforming action here. We all loved it as a kid. So, and that rounded out the 1991 season for Genesis. Lots of great games to choose by now. How did it fare up against the NES? Well, let's get our little list here. Let's go down now. By 1991, the Nintendo, good old Nintendo, was, yeah, it was losing steam. And as you can see, this is a little bit shorter than 1990, and the quality is a little bit lower. Why? Well, that's because of the Super Nintendo arriving, and it had already arrived in Japan in 1990. So the NES, nevertheless, still had some cool things. G.I. Joe, I didn't know this was a good game until recently. This is apparently a very interesting action platform game. You could choose different characters which have different abilities. So that was a good game. Metal Storm was the game where you play a mecha. You can change gravity. Also pretty interesting graphics. I never liked the colors, but the animation's cool in the backgrounds. Featured on the cover of Nintendo Power. Same as Power Blade, which is another excellent, quick action adventure platforming game for the Nintendo. Kind of a little bit dark, but cool. Puzznik, what was that again? Oh, geez, I added it to the list, but I don't remember. It's obviously a puzzle game. Now, Battletoads was probably the biggest game in 1991 for the Super Nintendo. Mega Man 4 wasn't released until the next year. And it's a beat-em-up by Rare. It's mostly known, I think, for the second level with the speeders, which was really hard to get by. I mean, as a kid, you eventually learned how to do those jumps, but we all hated that. The fun part was treating it as like a beat 'em up. So that was good old Battletoads. A very good golf game. I don't know why I only got a 75. Was NES Open Golf featuring Mario. So finally, the Nintendo had a golf game that could compete with PGA Tour. Micro Machines was awesome. Later to be released also for the Genesis. Top-down racing game. You could play with 4 players, I think, on the Nintendo. Really fast. A lot of fun. Adventures of Lolo 3. Now, Part 2 was also okay, but 3 apparently has the highest grades. I've never played these games, but if it gets an 85, it must be good. And that was released in around summer 91. Oh, no, actually November 91. Now, Vice Project Doom was one of the last excellent NES games. Side-scrolling game. Oh, geez, I always get it confused with Shatterhand and Power Blade. Also on the cover of Nintendo Power. Oh, here's Shatterhand. You punch everything. And then finally, the big one, Tecmo Super Bowl. This replaced Tecmo Bowl. You had more characters on the screen, and still being played to this day. Probably the best football game ever made. So, yeah, by 1991, it was obvious that the Genesis had a better choice of games than the Nintendo. Now, there was the Super Nintendo, of course, being released, and I'm going to briefly mention games like Super Castlevania 4, Super Mario World, Pilot Wings, F-Zero. I think those were the biggest games at the time for the Super Nintendo. I loved SimCity. I mean, I played it on the PC, but I also wanted the Super Nintendo version because it had a couple of extra things that got me really excited. There was also ActRaiser was also big, especially the sound department, and I just loved ActRaiser. So I hope this gives you a better idea of what it was like to have considered buying either a Genesis or something else. The big takeaway is that the games on the Genesis were not that good up until late 1991. There were a couple of great hits. If you look at this list, you'll see the exclamation points behind or in front of the games that I think really stood out. Of course, there was Strider 1990, Castle of Illusion, and John Madden Football. 1990 was a good year for Genesis, especially the second half. But still, the Genesis was still more of a curiosity. You want it because, hey, it's not a Nintendo, it's something different. Yeah, we're getting impatient waiting for the Super Nintendo. And it cost $190. Halfway through 1991, the Genesis was $150, and you got Sonic the Hedgehog instead of Altered Beast, and that changed everything. Now all of a sudden, the Genesis was probably a better thing to buy than the Super Nintendo. And yeah, we were getting tired of the NES by then. One thing I would like to mention, though, and I forgot to mention in the last video, I talked about 1989, mostly focusing on the games that year, but in all fairness, there were still a lot of games from earlier years, from 87, 88, that you still had not gotten and still wanted in 1989. We're talking about Super Mario Brothers 2, Zelda 2, what else did you have? Like Blades of Steel was also popular, Punch-Out, I don't know. There was, Blaster Master, Bionic Commando. There were so many good games for Nintendo. We know that because, a couple of years ago we had the Nintendo, the mini version, and it has like 30 games that are all fun to play. The Super Nintendo version has like 21, and the latest Genesis game also has 30 games, but a lot of them are kind of So, Nintendo had so many great games, and they were expensive back then. You were lucky if you could get them less than $40. So yeah, me as a kid, and it was always like a community thing. You were always borrowing games from other friends. So I always think in terms of we as a kid. When I think back of the late 80s, early 90s, we as kids, there were so many games for Nintendo we were still trying to play and get through that we really didn't feel like we needed a Genesis to have fun. There was always something new to discover, especially in those long Nintendo games. And you were extra blessed if you got into Dragon Warrior and Final Fantasy. I tell you, it took me years to beat those games. And I think Final Fantasy, like Zelda 1 had like the second quest. Zelda 2, it wasn't that hard as people tend to say nowadays, but still, I remember still playing that game in 1991 with friends. These were big, to us they were big games back then, and they kept us entertained. But, you know, Sonic the Hedgehog was really cool, Streets of Rage was totally awesome, and it turned out there were also other fun games for the Genesis. Next time, I'll be talking about another part of Genesis history, which I'll be calling this Genesis versus the Super Nintendo, and I'll be doing up to like, I think 1994, late 94. This is when Genesis was actually doing better than what Nintendo was doing, at least in America. And then I also want to have a part 3, where that would be 1995, maybe 96, where I would call it Genesis versus Sega, because in all fairness, the Genesis could have gone strong a little bit longer, I think, but Genesis started doing really, really stupid things in the mid-90s, and that cut that hampered the selection of games for the Genesis. So, thanks for listening. Check out my other videos on Final Fantasy. I've made a Final Fantasy ROM hack called Ultra Final Fantasy Champion Edition, which is I think is really awesome. It'll show a lot about my love about the game. And check out my videos on Edge Magazine, where I go through the history of the 90s using older Edge magazines, which was at the time and still is the best video game magazine for adults. So thanks for listening. See you around.